If you would, turn in your Bibles to the first chapter of Colossians. We'll pick back up there this morning as we begin. Let's begin this morning with a prayer, and I'm going to ask Brother Vernon Perriman, if he would, to direct our minds in prayer as we start our class. Yeah. Book of Colossians is one that's considered a short letter that Paul wrote to the church at Colossae. If you remember last week, there's an interesting thing that we noticed about this particular book that Paul wrote, that in most cases when Paul wrote to a location, he wrote to church that he established. But in this case, we understand that Paul was not available to do that. He was hindered from going into this area, and so he is not the one who, as it were, planted this church. So who was that? You remember? It's right there in the very first part. Verse 7, in fact, gives us the idea of who was involved with that. Epaphras. And so no doubt we're seeing that there are difficulties that are going on here at the church at Colossae. And we'll only go back over that just a little bit this morning, because as we look at the textual study, we're going to see that there are a number of things that Paul's going to say that are going to hit at how to deal with some of these things that they're having difficulties with. So we talked about it last week a little bit. They do have apparently the Judaizing teachers are involved in some extent. We'll get into that as we get on into the book a little bit. So always having to deal with that, the fact that we know about the gospel, we know about the church, but we still believe you need to follow after the law of Moses. And that's a recurring theme in a lot of places, as Paul would go and establish a church, preach the gospel, and then have to come back and defend that because people would come in teaching Judaism. So that's something they have to deal with. But we had something else we talked about last week, and that was the Gnostics. And the Gnostics, what is that? When you say that, what does that bring to mind? Secret knowledge, maybe even superior knowledge. We know more than you do, and you need to trust us because we're more aware of what's going on. And you could see how that might hinder a congregation as they come in and someone would say, well, we have knowledge that's above your knowledge. And not only that, they said that they could talk with who? They could communicate with these people who are at higher levels. And if you remember, we talked about last week, the way they looked at it, it was as if there was a hierarchy of power, God being at the very top, and then that angels were ministers that God used. And what did He use them for? Well, we know they were messengers, but in their way of thinking and relating back to the beginning of creation, what did He use them for? You remember that the one of the statements that we said last week was they believed that matter was what? Evil. And so God could not have anything to do with firsthand creation because He would have to deal with matter. And matter's evil. Okay? So what did He do to bring about creation. Who did he use? Angels. And so the angels were the ones who got their hands dirty, as it were. And the angels were the ones who did things that created the earth through God's direction and authority. So these are some of the things that they're dealing with. People are coming in and talking about these things. Now, one of the things that we talked about last week is the fact that there were those who were from the Western world who came over teaching witchcraft and magic. And they had to deal with that a lot here in the church. And so we're seeing all these influences come in, and they're having to deal with that. And if you could imagine, I know it's not easy for us today, but if you could imagine that we're just really weak in understanding what God is all about and what the Bible teaches, and someone comes in and starts saying, well, let me explain it to you, and they bring in a perversion, or they stretch the truth into some lie, it's going to be difficult for a young congregation to combat that. Now, these people were no doubt faithful. They were striving. They were trying to do what was right. If we pick up in verse 9, for example, well, verse 8, who Epaphras was a faithful minister, verse 7. Verse 8, who also declared unto us, that is, Epaphras declared unto Paul, and who else did Paul say the letter was coming from in verse 1? Timothy. And so he says, Epaphras also declared unto us your love in the Spirit. They had the right kind of love. They were wanting to do what was right. It wasn't as if they were opposing what Epaphras was teaching them, or were going astray, as it were, in rebellion to the teachings. But they're going to run into some difficulties. And he says, we know what your love is in the Spirit, that you're strong and you're trying to do what's right. For this cause we also, since we know of your love in the Spirit, he says, for this cause we also, since the day we heard it, did not cease to pray for you. And the concern is there, the care is there. A young congregation, tender, as it were, like a plant. And as we know, a lot of us will do a little gardening, or we'll do something. And those plants, when they first come out of the ground, are tender, aren't they? And we have to sort of protect them, and then once they get on up a little bit and get a little bit tougher and stronger, they can withstand some things. But he recognizes them as a tender plant, as it were, and he says, we didn't cease to pray for you. Now look what else he says. And to desire that ye might be filled with the knowledge of his will in all wisdom and spiritual understanding. Now, why is that important? Why is it important that Paul continue to desire that they might be filled with the knowledge of his will, that is, the Father's will, and be filled with the knowledge of his will in all wisdom and spiritual understanding? Okay? He's trying to combat some things here. And they're hearing that, well, you know, there's this secret knowledge, and that these Gnostics have knowledge that's above what they know, and they can't obtain it, as it were. Not unless they start embracing the Gnostics and saying, oh yes, we understand you have superior knowledge, teach that knowledge to us. And so Paul's trying to combat what's going on here. So he says, our desire for you is that you know his will. You know his will, not what somebody else is saying. And he says, we want you to know his will in all wisdom, have the understanding of how to apply that knowledge, and he says, spiritual understanding. If someone comes in and teaches to us something that is spiritual, how do we deal with that? Let's just look at it this way. Somebody comes in and says, let's say that they're this is in a situation where they're wanting to trade something. And they come in with a bucket of stuff. I don't know what it is. Some kind of material or something that's can be of value. It could be just about anything. But they bring it in and they say, this is, let's say this is so many pounds. Okay, well, you know, if we know that person, grew up with them, know that they've been honest from the first day of their existence, and we know that they have a good reputation, we may say, okay, that's 4 pounds or that's 5 pounds. What happens if somebody comes in and says, I want to trade something, and this is 5 pounds worth of whatever it is? What does the merchant at that store do? He weighs it. And how's he going to weigh it? Just pick it up and say, well, yeah, that's about 4 or 5 pounds. How's he going to know it's 4 or 5 pounds? He has scales, but tell me something about those scales. Those just scales he just built in the back room, or tell me something about those scales. They're certified. They have been calibrated to be exact in their measurement. And so he's going to take that stuff that's been brought in, and he's going to go over here and he's going to weigh it, and he's going to confirm that it's 4 or 5 pounds, whatever the guy said. What do we do in spiritual terms? Someone comes in here and they start saying, well, you know, if you really think about it, God, He can't really be in contact with matter because matter is inherently evil. And so He wasn't involved in the creation. And so He had His angels do it. Well, what have some of these people been taught if they've been taught the gospel? If they have been taught the gospel, who have they been taught that created the world? That Jesus did. And they have been taught that Jesus is the Savior of the world. And that Jesus was a man. Came to this earth and dwelt as a man. And that He was among us and He walked among us, which means He touched matter. And if you touch matter, then you're evil by association, right? So how do you deal with that? Well, they didn't have the written word at that point that was collectively like we have it today in bound form. But they had the writings of Paul. And Paul is saying, I want you to increase your spiritual understanding. It's important what I'm writing to you. This is not just a letter, hi, how you doing? Hope the weather's fine over there. Been feeling well lately, you know? This is a letter that instructs how they are supposed to understand things in terms of God and His Son and the church. And so it's important. So someone comes along and says, well, you know, that's not really right. What's really right is angels were involved in that. And oh, by the way, we can talk to those angels, and you don't have that knowledge yet. But we do, and that's what really happened. Because after all, God cannot be associated with matter because He is pure and holy, and matter is evil, and you don't understand. So this is an extremely important aspect of what He's saying that He desires for them. You need to have a knowledge of His will. Not what they're telling you, but His will. And you need the wisdom and the spiritual understanding that goes along with that. Important, very important. Okay, now what's the purpose of it? Verse 10, that ye might walk worthy of the Lord unto all pleasing, being fruitful in every good work and increasing in the knowledge of God. First of all, we're only going to be doing things that are fruitful and pleasing to God if we're doing whose will? His will. Who has presented His will to them? Who presented it to them? Epaphras. Where did Epaphras apparently learn it? We think from Paul. Where did Paul learn it? From Christ. Okay, so here we see that this is something that, again, is important, that you're only going to bear fruit if you walk in His will. Not what these people are telling you, not these false teachers that are trying to take you away. And notice what he says. They want you to follow His will, being fruitful in every good work. Does that imply that there were maybe some things that might have been perceived by these Gnostic teachers as good? I'd say, yeah. There are probably some things that people say, well, they do good work. Or they seem to be good people. They seem to be nice people. Well, that's good that people are that way. But those are the kind of people that we have to watch. Just because somebody is good and nice and friendly doesn't mean that they're holding on to the truth. So we've got to pay attention to that. We want to be pleasing to the Lord, not to men. And that will be able to make us fruitful in every good work. And he says, increasing in the knowledge of God. Well, hasn't he already talked about that? Isn't that what it said in verse 9? That's how important it is. He talks about it again because it's that important, that we need to be always increasing in the knowledge of God. Now, is that passage applicable to us today? Is there really any need for us to increase in the knowledge of God? Yeah.
That may be the case, but when they start saying, based on my knowledge, they start teaching things that are contrary to obvious teachings that are open to everybody, then you have basically the same situation as the Gnostics. The thing with the Gnostics was, they said, okay, evil cannot live in the sight of God. And they made an assumption. All flesh, all earthly things are evil. And everything is from that. Because if they can get you to buy that argument, then you were stuck in their path. You had to follow their rights,
right.
Their things to grow up.
Right. And that's no different today. If someone could come in and give us a plausible explanation for something that maybe we even struggle with, if they get us to buy in on a point, then it's one of those things, like Pat says, then you're sort of following in the direction they want you to go in. How intimidating is it for someone to come in here and says, I'm some kind of, I'm an astrophysicist, and I have, been studying the Bible along with, I've got my PhD or 2 PhDs, and I've been studying the Bible intently for 20 years now or something. And I look at it in terms of what I know about this universe and stuff, and I've come to this conclusion. How intimidating would that be? Yeah. Yep, make it. Exactly. Exactly. And so if we don't have an understanding of the Scriptures and a knowledge of God, can someone lead us in a direction like that? And it's absolutely. So this is why this is important for us to even pay attention to today, because we need to understand that these things will happen. They will creep in, and we will need to be prepared to address these things, but we do it through the knowledge of God and His understanding of His teachings. And so if we don't prepare ourselves, we don't know, well, it sounds plausible. I don't know why it couldn't be truthful. Maybe I ought to believe what he has to say if someone comes in like that. So we have to be careful about it. And this is what he's making them aware of, that they should be increasing in the knowledge of God. Strengthened with all might. Now, you know, one of the things I like about doing textual studies is Tim has made this statement a number of times. These things are not fillers, so that Paul says, well, you know, I've only written what I would consider to be half a letter. Let me go back now and just fill stuff in. Let me make it bigger so it looks more important. Everything that is said here has importance. And so we need to understand it when we look at it. Now, we don't need to try to put more into it than's there. But look at this statement. Strengthened with all might. Now, let me give you this analogy. Let's say that I want to get in better shape, and I'm going to do it through weight training. And so I go into the gym, and I pick a weight that just, oh man, that's pretty easy. I'll start there. I'll just start there. You know? And that went too hard. Well, next week or the following 2 or 3 days that I go through, say I'm going to go 3 times a week or something, I go and I lift that same weight. I'm making progress. Look here. 2 weeks later, I'm still lifting the same weight. How much stronger am I getting? I'm not. Sorry, I'm not. How do we get stronger? We increase the resistance, don't we? And as we push against that resistance and we increase it each, few days or whatever, we start out and we're lifting 100 pounds, and next thing we know, several months later, we're up to almost 300 pounds. Wouldn't get there if I didn't increase the resistance and work at it. That's what he's saying here. Strengthened, how? With all your might. This is the effort he's talking about putting into it. How do we become strong Christians? Well, the doors are open 2 or 3 times a week. I'll just come and listen to a lesson or have a Bible study, and I'm going to increase my knowledge. Well, you might increase it a little bit. But one of the things I've learned through the years is that you really increase your knowledge proportional to what you put into it. And so when we come and let someone teach us, since we really didn't prepare that much for that, we don't get that much out of it. It's not that we don't get something out of it. We just don't get a lot out of it. You start challenging yourself by teaching a class, or you challenge yourself to study every day. And I don't mean just pick it up and read. Well, I read 5 verses today. Well, what did they say? Oh, something about God and Christ and, living faithfully or something. I don't know. Until we put the effort into it, we're not going to grow. Strength comes from working hard at something. Okay? And he says, strengthen yourselves with all might. That means that they've got to put effort into it. And so that's important. False teachers can come in and lead us astray if we are not strengthening ourselves and putting forth the effort to do it. And, if someone were really find their way into congregations that was really putting forth enough of an effort to try to teach you something, they might just be pretty successful. It takes effort even sometimes to teach false doctrine, because you have to know enough to try to convince people that you know what you're talking about. And so fortunately we don't have just people knocking at our doors all the time. that are saying, here I'm here with a false doctrine, you try to refute me. But the point is, we have to be strengthened, and it takes effort. He says, strengthened with all might according to his glorious power, God will work within us to make us strong. He's not going to leave us out there. We're not on our own, but he will do it according to his glorious power. And he says, unto all patience and long-suffering with joyfulness. Now, if you've heard Paul talk about on a number of occasions, when he talks about the people he writes to, he doesn't consider having to teach them and to re-emphasize to them what they ought to be doing and the things that they ought to be paying attention to. Paul doesn't look at that as a burden, does he? He's always talking about it being joyful, being patient with them and trying to get them to grow is something that he knows is necessary, and he's glad to do it. And so this is something that he indicates the patience that will be there, the long suffering, and it's a joy for them to watch them grow. And he endeavors or desires for them to do that. Giving thanks unto the Father, and obviously we're going to start seeing a setting here of a priority or a setup or an understanding of who is involved in a relationship with God. Okay? Because we're being told by these Gnostics, well, angels are in that hierarchy. Okay? So when we talk about hierarchy, that means a situation where we sort of have a pyramid kind of organization. There's somebody at the top, and then as you go down that pyramid, you can see that there's maybe a couple here, and then we get to 3 here, and then 4 and 5 and so forth. So it's in a pyramid shape. And that hierarchy is there, God at the top. And if angels did the dirty work, then there's things that are beings in between them. And obviously here again, you don't understand that because you don't have the knowledge, but I talk to all these different kinds of beings, okay? So he's going to establish here the right organization or the right relationships that exist. And so here he says, giving thanks unto the Father, God the Father, giving thanks to him which hath made us, okay, there it is, we were made in the image of God, and it's God who's made us. Now, if the Gnostics were commenting on this verse, what would they say? Well, the angels were involved in it. God didn't really make you. The angels did. Well, that's not what Paul's teaching. That's not what he's saying here. Giving thanks unto the Father, which hath made us. And he has made us, he says, meet. And here we have the same rendering of the word that we see in Genesis, where he said man was alone and God made him a help meet. And I think we've had trouble with understanding that passage for a number of years, because some people say it's a helpmeet. And it's like, what's a helpmeet? It's 2 words. A help meet. A help that is appropriate. So God has made us then, he says, he hath made us appropriate, or he has established us in a certain situation or relationship, he says, to be partakers of the inheritance of the saints in light. Now, we've talked about this on a number of occasions. How did God make us to be partakers of the inheritance? Okay, through the process or the plan that he established, as he says in Ephesians chapter 1, before the foundations of the world, that we would be in him. He had chosen us to be in him. Not predestination, but the process whereby we could become sons of God. And so it says that God has made us, and he has prepared us, as it were. He has made us appropriate to be partakers of the inheritance of the saints in light. Now, when you talk about this terminology, what does light equate to? Goodness, righteousness. Who do we usually equate it with? God, His Son Jesus Christ. Who is it that's in this light? What does he say here? Inheritance of the saints in light. Now, what's the Gnostic going to say about that? That's just foreign, you know. Here we have a situation where those people who walk the earth, that you people in this age of the gospel, the church, are calling saints in light. Now, the Gnostic, how would he view mankind? He's material, therefore he's evil. And so as they look at mankind, they say, well, you're inherently evil, you know. And it's not until you sort of, and this is me saying this, but I really think this is their intent. Until you can rise above this physical world and get into this state that we're in as Gnostics, these knowledgeable people, until you can get into this state of knowing, you'll never get to the point of where you can escape the physical aspects of the world. So therefore, you're always going to be evil until you can get like us. And what Paul is saying here is, look at this passage. We give thanks unto the Father, and they'll recognize who the Father is. They believe that God is righteous and all this. But look what's happened. The Father has made us. He's made us He's turned us into something that's appropriate to be partakers of the inheritance of the saints in light. This is totally contrary to what they would teach. That mankind can't be in light. God is in light, but mankind can't be in light. But that's not what Paul's teaching. And Paul says the very one that they recognize as superior, that is God, is the one who has allowed us to become partakers of light. Totally contrary to what the Gnostics would teach. And he says, who, that is God, hath delivered us from the power of darkness. And see, that's where they say everybody is. We're all in darkness. Well, it's not that we don't agree with that sin in the world, that everyone has the difficulty of dealing with sin, and that we're all sinful. That's what Paul taught in Romans, wasn't it? For all have sinned, fall short of the glory of God. There's no doubt about that. There's no argument that we were in darkness. But the Gnostic says the only way that you could escape from that is through some superior knowledge like I have. And he's saying here that God has delivered us from that power of darkness and hath translated us into His kingdom. Now, how in the world, in their world, other than the knowledge, and obviously if you're talking to angels and higher beings, then maybe that's your gateway to get somewhere other than this evil material world, this matter world that we live in. That's your way of escaping it, through an understanding and a knowledge and association with those beings who are superior to mankind. That's not how God did us. Paul says He's translated us out of darkness. He's translated us into the kingdom of His dear Son. Now there again, it's going to be a difficult one, because how did the Gnostics view Christ? If he came here and lived among men, then he was therefore sinful. And there's no way for a sinful, manly being to be the Savior of the world, to be able to provide salvation, and to have a relationship directly with the Father. Because, listen, the angels were removed from men, right? The angels higher than man? Yes. And so if they were the ones who created the world, and they were removed from that by some level, then how could God send a man down to this earth that was His Son to save sinful mankind? He's matter Himself. He couldn't be the Savior of the world. And so Paul says, look here, you don't understand God's power nor His plan. Listen to what he says. Who hath delivered us from the power of darkness and hath translated us into the kingdom of His dear Son. That's how God established it. Now the Gnostic would argue with that. No, it can't be that way. But Paul says that is the way that God did it. And so these are very, very important things that are being discussed here. They need to grasp them and hold on to them as the spiritual knowledge of how God intended for it to be. Now, translated us into the kingdom of His dear Son, in whom, that is, in His Son, we have what? Redemption. The Gnostic says it can't be. Can't have a manly matter down here on earth that would provide redemption. Couldn't happen. But Paul says that it's in Him, the Son of God, who walked on this earth. He hath given us redemption. And what has He done it through? His blood. Well, what is blood? Material. Oh, man, are you kidding me? So Paul is saying all this stuff that you're being taught, you're being told by these Gnostics is just garbage. Because God sent His Son in the form of a man, and He provided redemption through matter, if you want to say it that way. Through blood. And so this just strikes at anything that the Gnostics have to say, and it therefore disproves that their teaching has any credibility, or it proves that their teaching has any credibility. I don't know if I said that right. You know what I mean. It's proving that they're false teachers. Let me put it that way. And so he says, we have this through His blood. Even, he says, what? The forgiveness of sin. You can't have it. You're matter. God says you can. God says that His Son will provide redemption through His blood. And so this is important teaching that they would need to embrace and then use to combat those things that are being taught to them by these false teachers. And he goes on to talk about Christ, who is the... Let's look at this now. Now, think about this. This is what he's saying. Look at what he says in the next verse. Who, that is Christ, His Son, who has provided forgiveness of sin, redemption through His blood. Who, Christ, is what? The image of God. Whoa! Is that powerful or what? This man, who is material, who is therefore in their minds evil, he is the image of God, who they say they worship and claim to be the supreme being. And now this material person that walked the earth, he's the image of God. Oh, you can't. Could you imagine them if they were to get their hands on this letter and read this? It'd just tear them up, wouldn't it? But do you see how beautifully Paul is laying out what God intended and how God's plan has been put into place and how it is so different than what the Gnostics are teaching? This Son of God, it says, is in the image of the invisible God. See, he talks about it in their terms. Have they seen God? No, they know that He's invisible. They haven't even seen the angels, but that's their theory, that the angels created this world. But now here's the Savior, and He's in the image of this invisible God. You see the die. Yeah, this is extremely powerful passage here and what it's saying, and it's just it's amazing how when you look at this chapter and you know what the Gnostics are teaching, how Paul is striking at everything that's going to refute what the Gnostics believe, and he just keeps doing it over and over again. Look at this. As we go on, who is the image of the invisible God? Okay, that's extremely important. But look at the next part of that passage. The firstborn of every creature. The American Standard Version, or I think it is, I have it here and mixed in with mine. It says the firstborn of all creation. But what about creation, according to the Gnostic? It's matter, and therefore it's evil. But here's the Son of God, who is in the very image of this invisible God, and He's the firstborn of all creation. How can that be? It so blows the Gnostics' teaching out of the water. Now look as he goes on in verse 16. For by Him, that is, by Christ, this firstborn of all creation, for by Him, what? Were all things created. Well, wait a minute now. What about the angels? That wouldn't have happened. They were all created by the Son of God. Now notice what he says here as he gets very, very specific. Look at this as we continue verse 16. For by Him were all things created that are in, what does he say? Heaven. Everything's in heaven. And those that are in the earth. What a conflict. What a conflict with their theory. And Paul's setting them straight here. He says he was, by Him were all things created that are in heaven, that are in earth. And notice this, visible and invisible. Interesting. Exactly. Now he says, whether these things are visible or invisible, whether they be thrones or dominions or principalities or powers, all things were created by him. And notice what he says in the very ending of that, and for him. For him. We'll pick back up here next week, but I think this is an extremely interesting study that Paul is trying to teach us here.